Are you winning fewer Secrets of Strixhaven drafts than you used to? And you don't know what exactly changed or how to fix what's wrong? Today I'm going to show you with data what might have happened and how you can fix it. The first thing to say is that you're very much not alone. A lot of people have this experience of a mid-format slump. There was this conversation in my Discord that got me thinking about what exactly this slump is when your win rate starts out higher and then slides for a reason that you can't really put your finger on. And then I started thinking that we could use data from 17lands.com, a wonderful client that provides public data on limited MTG, to track the evolution of the format so far and make conjectures about why different types of players with different types of preferences might have started out in the upper stratosphere of win rate and slowly start having a harder and harder time as the format moves along. So huge thanks to 17lands.com for all the data that I'm going to use in this video. What we're looking at here is a chart of the win rates of each color pair on the first day of the format. And if you're audio only, don't worry, I'm going to describe all of the images that we'll see. A chart like this can be a lot to take in. So first I'm going to run through it, giving you a broad impression of how the format has evolved. And then we'll break down how players with different preferences might experience this in their win rate. So on day one of the format, Lorehold red-white is way out on top. People who drafted Lorehold that day won more than 60% of their games, on average. Several percentage points below that is Silverquill white-black. Silverquill players rang in with about a 57 to 58% win rate, so a solid 3-ish percentage points below the Lorehold players. Another 2 percentage points below that was Prismari blue-red. And then finally, bringing up the rear with a 54 to 55% win rate were the two green-based colleges. So Lorehold way on top, then Silverquill, then Izzet, then the two green-based ones, Witherbloom and Quandrix. Day 2 of the format, the separation between the two white-based archetypes disappears. So you have Lorehold and Silverquill becoming pretty much equivalently strong with a 58 to 59% win rate. And all three other colleges bunch up as well, about 3 percentage points lower, 3.5, at around 55 percentage point win rate. So basically you want to be playing white on day 2, and any other college is pretty substantially worse, but equivalently good to each other. And I've also charted a curve for 3+ colors. I'm using that kind of to represent everything else in the format. We could think of a well-constructed Converge deck as being a probably better performing sub-archetype of that average, because all 3 colors includes, let's say, a Mardu deck where you started out Silverquill, it didn't quite get there, and you had to add in a bunch of red, but it also includes your like premium ideal Converge deck. So if you want to think about how the Converge deck is doing, I would say add a few percentage points to that 3+ colors curve, but that 3+ color average is bringing up the rear by a lot. It's all the way down at like 52.5%. So you want to be playing one of the main colleges, and you really want to be playing white at this stage in the format. The next day, not that much changes. The only difference is Silverquill and Lorehold get closer together at around 58 percentage points. And we start achieving some separation with Witherbloom. One of the early stories of this format has been green-black lagging behind the other colleges. Day 3 is really when that starts to happen. Simic, Quandrix, and Prismari Izzet, those two are very close together, and green-black starts to kind of fall out of the pack. Another thing that starts happening here is that the 3+ color combinations start rising a little bit on day 3 of the format. So let's look through the next few days. And by the first Saturday of the format, April 25, which I think is a really interesting day to focus on, because you would think a lot of this heavily invested player base that's using 17 lands and contributing data to this data set, probably a big chunk of them had just gone to Friday Night Magic the day before. So this is the first day that people would have experienced in-pod paper drafts before they sit down to draft on this Saturday. Things bounce around a fair bit in this plot because I'm using single day averages, not a moving average deliberately. But basically by this Saturday, you have Silverquill just barely overtaking Lorehold to be the best archetype in the format at around a 57% win rate. Among the other 3 colleges, you have Simic just a few percentage points below that. And by the way, I'm including little splashes in each of these. They're kind of binned together with the college. So this could be like Simic splashing a black pip for a Converge card, Simic splashing a mountain for a Converge card. That kind of archetype is only a few percentage points below the 2 white-based colleges. And then below green-blue is blue-red Prismari. And below that is green-black Witherbloom, which is really suffering by now in the format. Not really suffering, but it is a little bit below the next best college. Something very interesting is that since day 2 of the format, April 22. Over the course of 4 days, the 3+ color pairs have been steadily on the rise. And that curve also corresponds to a slow and not so steady rise in the quality of Simic. So it seems like this is where people have pretty much cracked the code on how to do Converge. It took a few days. They took some beatings along the way, but now it kind of seems like there are 4 decks in the format. There's the 2 white-based decks. There's the Is It decks. There's the Converge decks. These are all kind of the 4 things that you want to be doing. And then Witherbloom is a little bit below that. We can haggle over the details, whether Converge is more of a Prismari thing, more of a Simic thing. I know this is a hot topic for conversation, but roughly I think that's a fair summary. I'm going to tab through the next few days, and basically we achieve some kind of stability. Witherbloom recovers a little bit and actually kind of catches up with Prismari. Simic loses, or Quandrix loses, a little bit of its ground. But all those changes really amount to just a bunching up of the 3 non-white colleges around 54 percentage point win rate, a bunching up of the 2 white-based colleges around a 57 to 58% win rate, and unfortunately, it looks like the 3+ color decks lost their ground after that high water mark of the first Saturday of the format. Something happened around there that seems to have been a bit of a turning point. Again, I don't want to call 3+ colors the same as Converge, but Converge is probably a little bit higher, maybe mentally at a fudge factor of like 1 or 2 percentage points, depending on what you think, to the 3+ colors and or the Simic curves. So Converge is probably doing a little bit better than Simic or the 3+ colors. That still puts it substantially below both the white-based colleges and also below where it was circa April 24, April 25, the end of the first week that the format was out. So now I want to go through this and tell the narrative of how this felt, depending on what type of a player you are. As we take the perspective of people with different college preferences, we'll look at both win rate data, and I'm also going to show you play count data, how many people actually got into these different colleges over time. So once we've built up a narrative of what might have happened to cause a mid-format slump that you might be experiencing, then I'll close with some key takeaways for how you can get out of that slump, knowing what we know about the format's evolution. Okay, so let's start with the Lorehold, and there's a reason why I'm starting this way. It actually is part of my own mid-format slump, or kind of early format slump. About 1 week into the format, I had been doing pretty well and feeling pretty good, but I actually took a few days away from drafting between the 24th and the 27th. On the 24th, when I left things off, I had just had a 5-3 draft, a 5-3 draft, a 7-2 trophy, and then a 6-3 draft with Lorehold red-white, all in the span of 3 days. Then I came back, and here's what happened. I picked up drafting on the 27th, and I got a 3-3 with Lorehold, an 0-3 with Prismari, and a 3-3 with Lorehold, all in a spree of early morning unrecorded practice drafts. And I kind of thought, wow, I stepped away for 2 days, and now I just suck at this format? Like, what the heck happened? I was putting up all these great numbers, and then suddenly just, like, totally fell flat on my face. Not completely flat on my face, but there is an 0-3 in there. That doesn't feel good. So if you are a white aggro enjoyer, how have you experienced this format? Starting out, it was really amazing. You were getting a 60.5% win rate with your Lorehold deck. You were getting like a 57+% win rate with your Silverquill deck. So if you were starting out in white aggro, you were really happy. Over the next day, those 2 win rates approached each other, a little bit better with Silverquill than before, pretty sharply worse with Lorehold than before, but they're still way better than every other deck in the format. And they stayed pretty much on par with each other, other than one weird dip in Silverquill on the 24th. You pretty much just see just some bouncing around 57 to 58% win rate forever with these 2 archetypes. They're clearly the best thing to be doing in the format. So why did they fall after, particularly Lorehold, why did it fall after day 1? It's a very simple story. Here are the play shares of each college, that is how often people actually end up playing this archetype. Is It started out, Prismari started out way in front, then green-black after that, then the 2 white-based colleges, and then Quandrix on the bottom. These are probably, I guess to some extent, people's baseline preferences, or just what they thought was good coming out of pre-release and preview season. Immediately on day 2, every single college gives away a little bit of share to Lorehold, which skyrockets. in its play rate from 15% up to about 18-19%. So basically, people noticed the whopping win rate of Lorehold on day one, maybe because it beat them, maybe because they did 2 drafts, their Lorehold one went great and their other one went terribly, maybe because of Twitter. But basically, everyone started drafting Lorehold after that. And Lorehold just kind of keeps rising in the play rate data. It over and over, day after day, pretty steadily rising up until around the 27th. So for about a week into the format, it rises up to having by far the plurality share of games played. And then it takes a little bit of a dip back down, I would say right around the 26th, 27th, when the 3+ color decks actually become the plurality deck of the format. So this totally matches the story about Lorehold. It remains basically the best thing that you can be doing, but nowhere near as good as it was when it was the most winning by far archetype and the 4th most drafted archetype on day one. So here's my first piece of actionable advice for you Lorehold enjoyers. Basically, if your high water mark was at day one and your mid-format slump came quickly after that, you probably just were early to the curve on knowing how good Lorehold is. People noticed your success and then they started eating your lunch. At the same time, I think Lorehold is still underdrafted. Look at its win rate data. On the most recent day I collected, May 2, it's the 2nd most winning college with about a 57% win rate, just behind Silverquill. On the same day, looking back at the play rate data, it is the 2nd most drafted, right behind the 3+ colors. It is technically the most drafted college, but that probably means it could support even a little bit more drafting. I say that partly because if you look at the regime from around April 23 to April 27, Lorehold was actually the most drafted college at that time. And looking back at the win rate data, in that same period, it was often the most winning college. So Lorehold is deep enough that it can support being the most drafted college and also the most winning on average. It already has for a big chunk of the early format. So I think people are a little bit lower on Lorehold now than they should be. So maybe your mid-format slump, if you started out as a Lorehold enjoyer, came because you vacated Lorehold in the first few days when its win rate fell noticeably. In that case, my advice is go back to Lorehold. I mean, read the signals, obviously, do what's appropriate in your seat in a given draft, but maybe be a little bit more inclined to go back to Lorehold. All right, what about Lorehold's friend, Silverquill? Then I'm going to do, if you're a Converge player, then I'm going to do pure Prismari sweetness. And a segment on Witherbloom as well, for you mid-range removal lovers. As I get into that, let me say, if you like this kind of effortful, deep dive, data-informed analysis of mtglimited, make sure that you're subscribed to my channel on YouTube. I post these kind of deep dive videos absolutely as often as I can. I did a data deep dive right before the recent Arena Direct on the weekend, and then I put the proof in the pudding. I used those data to, in my one run that I had time for in the Arena Direct, actually convert my 6,000 gems into, spoiler alert, a collector booster box that I won in that run. And at least every week, I do a data deep dive like this, where I talk about, for example, if you're struggling in Strixhaven draft, how you can use the data that we have to get better results. This is a channel all about positive-minded, steady improvement at limited magic, using every tool at our disposal. And of course, my bread and butter is also daily draft videos where I show you how to put that data and that analysis into practice to get better at limited together as a community. So if that appeals to you, make sure that you are subscribed and catch the next video just like this one. All right, so what if you were a Silverquiller, another flavor of white aggro? And we can argue about whether Lorehold actually is aggro, but you know what I mean, a kind of probably faster white deck. So the Silverquill perspective on this format has actually been quite boring. Silverquill started out at about a 57% win rate, goes through a few ups and downs and a few whatevers, and ends up at about a 57% win rate as of May 2. And pretty much with the exception of one weird day for Silverquill, it was like pretty flat the whole way along. It's not like it went way up and went way back down. And honestly, the play data bear that out as well. So Silverquill, you know, pretty much started out at about 16 or 17% market share of like how much people were playing the different colleges. Pretty much didn't go up, pretty much didn't go down. It's just still right where it was, 16%. So if you've been drafting a lot of Silverquill, your Silverquill decks are performing about as well as they were before. And chances are you're getting into Silverquill at tables where other people are Silverquill about as often as they were before. So if you're a white-black mage, this has been a pretty uneventful format evolution for you. So if you're really trying to avoid a mid-format slump, I would say Silverquill is just a pretty safe place to park. However, you remember Silverquill being 8 days ago, it's doing pretty similarly now. Pretty much the exact same now. All right, so that was the white-based kind of aggro decks. A major part of the evolving wisdom about this format, the conventional wisdom, has been that it's white-based aggro versus 5-color soup. So I kind of want to put that to the test in format evolution terms. If the other pole of this format is the 3+ color decks, let's say, then what has the ride looked like for someone who's trying to break into that since day one? Okay, so Converge is complicated because there's no Converge college. I can't just plot Converge here, right? So what I'm doing is I'm using Simic or Prismari, but probably mostly Simic, and the 3+ color decks as a proxy for how the Converge decks are doing. The Converge decks are somewhere in there. Maybe sometimes you could have a Witherbloom green-black base Converge deck, but most of the time it's going to be properly 3+ colors, or it's going to be base Simic to use the green fixing, or base Prismari to use the control inclination and the tons of treasure tokens. So the Converge deck is probably a little bit above the win rate of the 3+ color decks, again, because the 3+ color decks include who knows how many train wrecks where someone just had to add a bunch of another color because they didn't make playables. But I'm going to argue that it's probably roughly parallel to how that curve is going, because my train wreck drafts, I mean, maybe they get less frequent as the format goes on, so I guess that could bias the Converge decks to be more above the 3+ color decks as the format goes on. But I'm gonna guess a train wreck is a train wreck is a train wreck. Let's just suppose that they make up a similar share of the 3+ color decks, so then let's add a fudge factor of like 1 or 2% to the Converge to get the Converge deck win rates out of the 3+ color pair win rates. Okay, so what does that look like over time? It starts off having a win rate that is way below all of the colleges. But as we saw, by the time we reach about the first Saturday of the format, when people are really starting to get more familiar with the cards, a lot of us have by now played in paper at Friday Night Magic, or just played a bunch of drafts online over the last few days. People are kind of figuring out how to make these 3+ color decks work. I'm going to say this amount of structure is not just because people are avoiding train wrecks, it's also because we're figuring out Converge. And it also seems to be boosting Simic a little bit. But then there's kind of a turnaround. Remember, we said April 25 is the high watermark for the 3+ color decks. It's also the high watermark for Simic. Simic falls and the 3+ color decks fall together after that. And then they kind of start a vague recovery that has been totally imperfect to this day. Neither one has yet achieved the win rate that they had on the first Saturday of the format. The story that I want to tell about that, sorry, I should move my camera so you can see where exactly the 3+ colors landed. The story I want to tell about that is that people figured out Converge pretty quickly in the first few days of the format. Then there was this solidified conventional wisdom that I keep hearing everywhere, which I think has a fair amount of truth to it, that it's a white aggro format or a Mardu kind of aggro format versus a 5-color soup format, much like Tarkir Dragonstorm was. But the thing is, after that first weekend, it looks like the Converge decks really fell. Simic, maybe people have figured out how to do Simic with a splash pretty nicely at this point. That is Quandrix with a splash. But the properly 3 or more color version seems to have gotten kind of eaten up. So let's see if the play rates reflect that. So with an eye on Quandrix and the 3+ color dashed curve, it looks like basically Quandrix got less and less and less drafted as time went on, which puts into context and explains why its win rate went up and up and up, at least after the 25th, or rather after this sharp fall following the 25th. It's really been going up since about the 27th, so for about a week. Meanwhile, in the play rate data, the 3+ color decks have been drafted more and more and more and more. I think this gives a lot of credence to the idea that we can use them as a proxy for Converge. Basically, from the first day of the format until that first Saturday, the 25th, I think people were trying to figure out how to do Quandrix and how to do the 3+ color decks. The 25th was the high water mark, especially for the properly 3+ color Converge decks. And when people saw how successful it was on that day, they just went all in, to the point that as of April 28th, so for the last week or so, the 3+ color decks have been the most drafted bundle of archetypes in the format. People are drafting 3+ colors more often than they're drafting any individual college, which was not true early in the format. On the first day of the format, the 3+ color decks were only the 5th most drafted. They were less drafted than every single college except Quandrix. So this is really interesting. What happened is no one was really drafting 3+ colors, or it was about on par with like a less popular college. Then people slowly figured out how to make it work at that level of contestation in the pod. So when it was not so drafted, people figured out in a few days how to do a great Converge deck. At that point, it became kind of one of the beaters of the format. It wasn't the best thing to be doing. It was kind of tied for, let's say, a good version of the Converge deck was doing a little bit better than that 3-color curve showed. So maybe it was like second place after the white aggro decks. People saw how good Converge was doing, and also when it wins in such a dominating, awesome looking, totally sweet seeming way. And they just steadily stepped into that lane more and more and more, day after day after day, until it is now the most drafted thing in the format, more or less, depending on how big a market share you think Converge makes up of the 3+ color decks. So my takeaway is Converge seems to be getting way overdrafted. It was totally sweet pretty early in the format when it was not being drafted pretty much at all. And it ended up winning maybe kind of like second most out of all the kinds of things that you could be doing. But that was one brief moment when lightning struck. It was so convincing a lightning strike that everyone flooded into that zone. And now it's just being totally overrun. Way too many people are trying to do properly 3+ colors. For some number of you, this just explains your slump right here. You're one of those people who started drafting Converge way more when you heard how good it is after April 25. And you are now in a tragedy of the commons where you, along with all the other people who jumped into Converge, are now just losing more. So look back over your logs. If you have been drafting Converge a lot and losing with it a lot, you're in very good company, and you and the people like you should just tone it down a little bit with the properly 3+ color stuff. The one thing I'll say though is Simic has been getting less and less and less drafted. People jumped into 3+ colors. They didn't jump into Simic with a splash. And Simic has been quietly just getting more and more winning over the last like 4 to 5 days while being drafted less. If that trend continues, Simic will noticeably be kind of the second best-ish thing to be doing. Sorry, I'm trying to be good about using the names. Quandrix may be a very safe place to park. If you're someone who loves Converge, you're very comfortable with Converge, but you've been getting a lot of 1-3s, 2-3s, 3-3 drafts with Converge, maybe just try to stick with a Simic base and splash your Converge payoffs. And it looks empirically like fewer people are doing that, and you'll probably get more of the good Simic stuff. Anecdotally, I totally saw this at the regional championship qualifier draft last weekend at a table of good players who were trying to do well playing for stakes. A lot of people were doing Jeskai spells kind of Converge style stuff, totally 3+ color Converge versions, but we had all sorts of Simic pieces flying around the table really late in pack 1 and pack 2. If that's happening on a lot of arena drafts, then I could imagine Quandrix is going to be a nice place to pivot if you're in a Converge-ish deck, like you start off with a few Converge payoffs, but you don't want to be one of those too many people trying to make 3+ colors work. Okay, 2 more colleges or 2 more play styles that I want to analyze like this, and then I'm going to give you some general advice about how to get out of this kind of mid-format slump. Okay, the 2 more that I want to look at are Prismari blue-red and Witherbloom green-black. Prismari is mainly interesting to me for how uneventful it has been, just like Silverquill. But what's interesting here is I totally imagined that something was going on with Prismari that just empirically was not. So I've laid out the curve for win rates, and focusing on Prismari, it's pretty flat. It started out at like 56% win rate. By day 2, people had kind of cottoned on to it being good, or to how good it was, I guess. Fell to about a 54-55% win rate, and it sort of stayed at that level. It's currently at like 54-ish. Its low point was a little bit below that. Its high point was a little bit above that, but Prismari has been very static at around 54%. Prismari play rates, well, it did start out as the most drafted college, but it fell, I would say, pretty quickly after that. It started about 21% market share, let's say, and then it landed around 18 to 19%, and that's about where it is today. The really interesting thing here is I kind of imagined that something was happening with Prismari that wasn't. There was a day like April 23 when it really broke in the Magic YouTuber sphere how good Prismari could be, particularly the Prismari No Creatures control deck. LSV put out a video on April 23 showcasing this. Paul Chion did one, I think, the next day. A bunch of other people were doing it around this time. And I suddenly started losing a lot more with Prismari. And the story I told myself is, those guys hyped up Prismari. They showed people how to play it. Now everyone wants to do it. Its play rate probably just surged, and now I can't get into Prismari when I was winning with it early in the format. The data, this is why we look at the data. They tell the exact opposite story. April 23, when LSV put out that video, Prismari was in the middle of a slide in terms of play rate. It was falling behind Lorehold on that day to become only the number 2 most played instead of the number 1 most played college. And then it just was like it fell a game the next day and was just very flat after that. So kind of nice to look at the data because, you know, sometimes you're telling stories in your head about what's happening in the pod and it's just not right. It's just not right. You're just making something up. So mea culpa there. When I was complaining about not being able to get into Prismari, it was actually completely in my head. But there is one thing that I want to draw your attention to here, which I think is what confused me. What was happening that day was something very different. It was not the LSV video. It was the ascendance of Converge. Because look at what did happen on April 23. Right when I thought I was getting totally cut on Prismari, what happened was everyone was suddenly drafting way more of the 3+ color, probably substantially Converge decks. And it only went up. April 23, it was like 2% higher market share than April 22. The next day it's like 3% higher market share, pretty flat after that, but then it goes up another 2% market share, another 2%, another 2%, another 1%, another 1%. Basically, I was watching the Converge pieces leave the table. It just so happens a lot of those pieces are exactly what you want for Izzet Control. Check it out. The cards that I was no longer seeing, I remember very specifically, Run Behind, the essentially 3 mana bounce something to the top or bottom. Banishing Betrayal, the 2 mana bounce something to the person's hand and surveil 1. Unsubtle Mockery, the red 3 mana deal 4 surveil 1. This is crucial interaction that makes the Prismari control deck tick. I would also play it often in Converge. If you look at my Win-a-Box video yesterday, I was playing a green-based Converge deck, which ran 2 Unsubtle Mockeries. I would take that in a lot of situations in Converge. So what I think happened to Prismari is if you're playing this big brain, no creature control version, I think it got cannibalized to some extent by the huge march of people towards Converge. They're taking a lot of the same exact interaction that you need to make your very controlling deck work. That hasn't exactly shown up in the win rate data for Prismari, which has been sliding a little bit, but overall pretty flat. But I think what might be happening there is probably most people are not playing that super specific, super controlling no creature version of Prismari. So maybe it was enough to hit my win rate because that's what I was trying to do, but it just didn't affect the general win rate of Prismari that much, though it is lower now than it was before. So my advice if you're a control Prismari mage is try to figure out what pieces might be getting taken by the many, many, many more people who are drafting 3+ color, probably substantially Converge style decks, and try to avoid that. Try to avoid collisions with them. Is there a way that you can build Prismari decks which doesn't use the same pieces that those Converge players are hunting for? Okay, last but certainly not least, I actually saved this one because it's kind of the most interesting compared to the conventional wisdom. Witherbloom, green-black. Conventional wisdom is this has been the odd one out, the worst college, the place you really don't want to be. So let's look at the Witherbloom win rate data with that in mind. It started around, 54.5, 55-ish%. It took some early knocks, but actually nothing that put it clearly below the pack. On a few individual days, it has been the lowest. If you check 17 lanes on April 23, April 25, it would stand out as the lowest. But actually between April 26 and pretty much today, it's kind of neck and neck with Prismari. And at essentially every moment, it's above the collection of all 3+ color decks, maybe performing pretty similarly to Converge in the current meta. I actually think Witherbloom is weirdly a victim of how people use the 17 lanes interface because there are these date selectors that make it so that the default way to look at the deck color win rates is a average over the entire period to date, which is one way of looking at the data. There are pros and cons of that way. But if you do that, basically Witherbloom suffers from the fact that at various points it has been the lowest and it never really had this kind of spike that other ones experience. Like Prismari had a big spike on the first day of the format that went away. Simic had a big spike on that one day, April 25, when Converge was looking so great, but that spike too also kind of went away. If instead of picking a range of days, you look at just the one day data point, which is going to have higher variation and therefore more fluctuation, but also in a certain sense is kind of what you care about, because what I actually care about is not what would happen to me on an average day since the set was released if I drafted this color pair. What I care about is if I fire up Arena right now, what's most likely to happen to me if I draft this color pair. If you look at it that way, Witherbloom's actually exactly tied with Prismari for the number or share of games that it won, rather, on exactly May 2. Which is what we see in the last data point of our plot, Witherbloom and Prismari right on top of each other. So I actually want to really complicate this idea, this conventional wisdom that everyone settled on, that Witherbloom is the odd one out and the worst performing in the format. I actually think it's only true as an artifact that arises when you take an average of the performance of each college over the course of the whole format, specifically because the other two worst-ish colleges, Quandrix and Prismari, they both had one high outlier day each that pulls their time average up. Witherbloom never got that one day when it just kind of jumped in the data and then went back down. So really, I think these three are pretty much equivalently good right now in the meta. I don't even think Witherbloom is an odd one out at all. If we look at the games played percent, Witherbloom started out as the second most drafted college, which I think makes sense. People online love creatures, aggression, and removal, to be quite honest. And then it sort of fell as this conventional wisdom hardened that Witherbloom is not where you want to be. Its win rate did not go way up, but I think that might also partly be because Witherbloom has a bunch of green that might be getting cannibalized for these Converge decks. So you don't really benefit in win rate from people not playing Witherbloom specifically, because the same cards might be getting taken by people who are playing Converge. So I think maybe if you like Witherbloom, you should kind of think about the same things. Like, how can I draft it maybe leaning black a little bit more than leaning green, or leaning away from Converge pieces, just in such a way that I'm not going to get stepped on by that big rise in the Converge player base. And maybe if you're not a Witherbloom mage and you've had a slump, maybe think about playing a little bit more Witherbloom. It's really not this college to be avoided like the plague, the way that I think sometimes the conventional wisdom, no particular person's telling of it, but kind of like the aggregation of things that people are saying might make it seem. So I would just say Witherbloom doesn't suck. It's not like the worst college, clearly. And the same kind of a thing. If you try not to get cannibalized by the 3+ color players, you might actually build a better version of Witherbloom. Okay, so that's all my specific advice informed by the format evolution data. I just want to give some general advice now as someone who's played a lot of limited, and then I'll wrap up. These are my concluding thoughts. My first thought, and this is what I just gave you all of the tools you need to do. My first thought is audit your color pair choices. So when I shared with you my particular slump on April 24, I had like 4 awesome drafts. 22, 23, and 24, I had like 4 drafts that went really well, more than got my gems back. Then I fired up Arena and I did these 4 drafts in a row where it went terribly. Or 3 drafts in a row. It's like 3, 3, 0, 3, 3, 3. 2 of them were Lorehold, 1 of them was Prismari. One mistake I made is when I stepped away from Arena 3 days before, I had drafted Lorehold and it had gone well. Clearly, when I came back, my mind was in a red-based space. I was overrating the red colors, right? Or the red cards, because I drafted 2 Lorehold decks and a Prismari deck in the span of about 3 hours. Not impossible that that was actually the open deck in each seat, but taking that tendency together with how badly it went, I'm going to say I was over evaluating red, and I was in specifically more of a Lorehold groove. 17 lands gives you a really nice way to do this. Here's my log for around that period I just showed you. The bottom 4, I was doing well and playing a variety of decks. So the period I've just highlighted makes a lot of sense. Then there's a pretty clear separation where I switch over to being way too likely to play blue, white, and red, I'd say, but especially red, white, and I start getting punished for it. Specifically, 3 early morning drafts that I did all in a row that went pretty badly. Then that evening, I came back to the computer, drafted Quandrix, and it went pretty well, 5-3. Something that I think definitely contributes to these mid-format ruts is when you get a good result with a color pair, you get comfortable with it, and then you just start overdrafting it because it becomes your groove. It's your comfort place. So just look back over your colors and see if that's happening to you. The rut that I just showed you definitely gives rise to another thought, which is, why did I draft 3 in a row in the morning and they went badly? Why didn't I just stop after 1? Or maybe stop after that Prismari 03? That's probably the moment to turn off Arena and go do something else with your day. You're probably, unless you're actively having fun train wrecking, you should probably just go do something else with your time. So I would say if you're in this kind of a rut, limit yourself to 1 draft per day. With the time that you free up by playing a little bit less, you can improve in many different ways. This is kind of selfish for me to point out as someone who posts content to YouTube, but you can consume more content. To make it not selfish, I'll say, go watch Paul Cheon draft. Instead of you drafting, watch Paul Cheon draft. The trick that I like to use and that I used as a major tool in my own improvement is to watch the video. When they see a pack, when the content creator opens a pack, pause the video. Think to yourself about what you would pick in their shoes. Then compare your pick to what they actually pick. In terms of making choices during draft, I think this is actually better for your improvement than actually doing a draft. Especially if if you do 19 drafts and one of that method, that's way better than doing 20 drafts. Another thing that you can do is go back over your games, see why you lost. I'm sure if I go back and look at that Prismari draft, I would find 100 opportunities to learn for places that I did things wrong and could have improved and not trainwrecked 03. And finally, if you have trouble motivating yourself to do analysis or you get stuck in your analysis, discussion helps. In the description, I have a link to a community Discord. It's also in the description for my channel. And we have an entire channel devoted to this, where you can just post your games and drafts for review, and people will jump in and tell you how they think they would have done things differently. So even if you don't have friends in real life who you can do this kind of discussion with, which I actually think is can often be the first best way of doing this, we have a community totally ready for you for future virtual friends who you can discuss your drafts with. All right, I really hope that helped. If you do break out of your mid-format rut, please share it here. I would love to hear that. If you're not subscribed and you like this data-informed way of getting better at Magic Limited with a always positive improvers mindset, make sure that you're subscribed to my channel. And until tomorrow, have tons of fun playing Magic and don't be afraid to splash.